Aria Wells donated her blood for a dying stranger in a marble mansion hallway, never knowing he was Dante Russo, the most feared Korean Mafia boss in South Florida. She had $200 in her pocket, a sick child needing $47,000 in 3 days, and nothing left to lose. The winter night was freezing cold even in Miami, stars sharp as diamonds through the floor-to-ceiling windows, frost creeping across the glass like ghostly fingers. The East Wing hallway stretched empty and cavernous at 11:47 in the evening. Aria knelt on cold Italian marble, her cleaning cart overturned beside her, medical supplies scattered across the floor like confetti at a funeral. Blood pooled beneath a man's shoulder, so much blood, spreading across white dress shirt in a dark bloom that would not stop growing. Dante Russo slumped against a column worth more money than she would earn in 10 lifetimes. His face had gone the color of old bone. Each breath came shallow, ragged, like a man drowning in air. His left shoulder bore a gunshot wound still bleeding, the edges of the torn fabric soaked crimson. 2 men in black tactical gear stood frozen 10 feet back. Marco and Theo. Guns drawn but useless now. Their eyes moved between the wounded man and the cleaning woman kneeling beside him, unable to compute what they were witnessing. She should have run. Every instinct screamed at her to scream, to flee, to call the police. Instead, she knelt closer. The smell hit her first, copper and iron mixing with the lemon cleaning solution still wet on her hands. Her own hands, shaking so badly she could barely steady them. She pressed her palms against the wound without hesitation, and the warmth of his blood soaked through her worn cotton gloves. Oliver's face flashed in her mind. Her 6-year-old boy, pale as milk, gasping for air the way this man was gasping now. His tiny hand reaching for hers in the hospital emergency room while doctors told her the number she could never afford. $47,000. 3 days until his surgery window closed. 3 days before the window to save his life sealed shut forever. She knew what dying looked like. She had watched it approach her son every single day. "I should run," Marco whispered to Theo, his voice barely above nothing. "Why isn't she running?" Aria's watch caught the chandelier light as she worked, a $9 Walmart watch, the second hand ticking away seconds of a life that was not hers. She tore her cleaning apron into strips with fingers that would not stop trembling, and wrapped the wound with pressure that made the man's eyes roll back. "What's his blood type?" Her voice came out steady. Amazed her. A stranger's blood covering her hands, and her voice came out steady. Theo stumbled forward, fear making him clumsy. "Oh, negative. Universal recipient, but he's losing too much, we need to get him to." "I'm O negative," Aria said, rolling up her left sleeve. Her skin was pale, marked with old bruises that had faded to yellow. "Universal donor." "Do it." She did not ask who he was. Did not ask what happened. Did not ask why 2 armed men stood in a mansion that cost more than entire neighborhoods, shock written across their faces like a death sentence. She only knew that someone was dying. Someone was dying the way her son would die if she did nothing. And her hands knew what to do. Theo's hands trembled as he brought medical equipment from somewhere deeper in the mansion. A blood draw kit. Tubing. Equipment that belonged in hospitals, not hallways. He found her vein on the first try, years of training, probably, searching for veins in the dark, and drew blood while she kept her other hand pressed against the stranger's shoulder. The blood flowed red and vital from her arm into tubing, traveling to him. Her blood entering his veins. Her life becoming part of his life. Dante Russo's black eyes opened. Eyes that held the weight of 1,000 decisions, 1,000 cruelties, 1,000 moments when he had chosen power over mercy. Those eyes found hers across the distance of inches and held. His pupils dilated as her blood entered his system. His breathing steadied, fractionally, just enough to suggest that death might reconsider. "Why?" His voice came like gravel, like someone had dragged his throat across broken glass. She did not answer. Could not answer. Only kept the pressure steady and watched the color return slowly, degree by degree, to a face that had been slipping away into darkness. "In 15 years, Marco said, still frozen, still watching. I have never seen him look at anyone like that." The tubing continued its work. Her blood became his blood. Her survival, offered freely to a stranger. But what she did not know was that this single act of mercy would unravel everything she thought she knew about survival. The man whose life she saved would become both her salvation and her most terrifying obsession. The blood flowing between them would bind them together in ways that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with a code she did not yet understand, a code that said when someone saves you, you owe them not just your life, but your entire world. What she did not know was that by tomorrow, she would be living inside that marble mansion. That in 3 days, her son's surgery would be paid for by a man whose name she was only now learning. That her entire existence was about to split into before and after, with this moment as the seam. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Now, let us go back to the beginning, to 12 hours earlier, when Aria Wells still believed she could save everyone by working hard enough. The Ashford mansion's East Wing kitchen smelled like expensive coffee and broken dreams. Aria stood at the sink at 7 in the morning, her hand submerged in water so hot it turned her skin red. The water was where she did her best thinking. The water was where she could disappear. Through the window above the sink, Miami sprawled grey and indifferent. November had brought cold even here, unusual cold, the kind that made the Gulf air bite. She could see the pool house from here, and the tennis court, and the guest cottage that probably cost more than her mother's entire life. She lived in a converted closet on the 2nd floor. Not a bedroom converted to a closet. A closet converted to a bedroom. 4 feet wide, 6 feet deep, a window the size of a dinner plate that faced the wall of the neighbor's property. She had hung a curtain rod across the opening and called it home. Her own apartment had evicted her 3 months ago. $200 to her name now. All of it. The crumpled foreclosure notice lived in her back pocket, worn soft from being folded and refolded so many times the creases had become holes. She had received the notice 14 days ago, delivered by a man in a suit who would not meet her eyes. Her landlord, Marcus Webb, had been very clear: pay rent or vacate within 30 days. Eviction proceedings had already begun. The state would take the apartment back, and she would be on the street. She could not afford the street. Oliver needed her. Her 6-year-old boy, asleep 3 rooms away in his small bedroom in the Ashford mansion, where he had lived since infancy. Lived because his parents had died when he was 4 months old. Lived because the state had placed him with the Ashford family, and they had hired Aria as his live-in nanny, and Aria had become the only mother he would ever know. 7 years. 7 years of waking at 5 in the morning to prepare his breakfast, 7 years of holding his hand during medical appointments, 7 years of listening to cardiologists explain the defect in his heart that would eventually kill him. A congenital condition. A time bomb in his tiny chest that would require surgery the way other children required birthday cakes. $47,000. She had managed to save $12,000. $12,000 in 7 years of working double shifts, of eating the leftovers she found in the Ashford family's refrigerator, of selling her plasma twice a month until the clinic told her iron was too low and they could not take any more. $12,000 toward a goal that felt like climbing a mountain with no summit. 3 days. That was how long the surgical window stayed open. The foreclosure notice crackled in her pocket, papery and vicious. She pulled her hands from the water and dried them on a thin towel that had been white once. Footsteps approached. Slow. Measured. The sound of expensive shoes on marble flooring. She knew those footsteps. They belonged to Victoria Ashford, the woman who had employed her for 7 years and never quite learned her name. Mrs. Ashford. Always Mrs. Ashford, never Aria. The silver needs polishing, Victoria said, not looking at her. I am having guests tomorrow evening. I expect the East Wing to gleam. Yes. Victoria Ashford was 48 years old but carried herself like a woman who believed age was something that happened to other people. Her hair was platinum blonde, pulled back so tight it made her face look like a mask. She wore a cream-colored linen dress that probably cost more than Aria's entire wardrobe. A diamond on her left hand that caught the light and threw it across the kitchen in tiny rainbows. "And Aria," Victoria said, turning toward the door. "Do not let Oliver play in the marble hallways today. The floors are slippery. An accident would be very inconvenient. Not an accident would be dangerous. An accident would be inconvenient." Aria waited until Victoria's footsteps faded before she let herself breathe. The foreclosure notice crackled again. $200. Oliver needed $47,000. The window was closing. And somewhere in this city, a man named Marcus Webb was waiting for her to make a terrible choice. He had already made it clear what he wanted. Made it clear that there were other ways to pay rent. She dried her hands and went to find Oliver. The alarm clock screamed at 5:45 a.m. It was the same alarm clock that had screamed at her for 7 years, a plastic thing the color of old teeth, sitting on a shelf 3 inches from her face. Aria Wells did not need the alarm anymore. Her body had learned to wake before it rang, learned to snap awake in the darkness of her converted closet room like someone startled from a nightmare. She sat up and hit the button before the second ring could finish. Silence returned. Good. The Ashfords hated noise before 7 a.m. Her room was 6 feet wide and barely 8 feet long. A single bed with a white metal frame, a narrow dresser that had belonged to the Ashford spare guest room 15 years ago, one bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a window that looked out onto the gardener's shed. No chair. No desk. No mirror. She dressed in the dark, pulling on the black uniform pants and white blouse that Victoria Ashford had purchased 7 years ago and expected her to maintain indefinitely. The fabric was thin now, nearly transparent in places, but buying new ones was not something poor people did. Poor people mended and wore until the seams gave way entirely. The bathroom down the hall was not the family bathroom. That one had marble counters, heated towel racks, and enough expensive bottles to stock a salon. Aria's bathroom was the staff bathroom, small and windowless, with a shower stall that had developed a leak somewhere behind the wall. Water dripped constantly, a sound like a clock counting down her life in single drops. She washed with water cold enough to make her gasp, dried her face on a thin towel, and was back in her room by 6:15 a.m. Down in the kitchen, she began the breakfast routine that had not changed in 7 years. Eggs for Martin Ashford, soft scrambled with chives from the garden. Oatmeal for Victoria, exactly 3/4 of a cup with a single teaspoon of honey because she was watching her figure. Toast for Oliver, cut into triangles because he refused rectangles, with almond butter because he was allergic to peanuts and everyone in this house was terrified of the lawsuits that might result from his accidental death. Aria made the food with the kind of precision that some people reserved for prayer. She was 39 minutes into her 14-hour day. She would not eat until after the Ashfords had finished lunch, if there was anything left. Oliver came down at 6:33 a.m., which meant he was early. His feet were bare, slapping against the tile floor, his curly brown hair sticking up at angles that suggested he had not bothered with his pillow. He was 6 years old and already carried himself with the kind of careful deliberation that sick children develop, as if his body was something that might shatter if he moved too quickly. His lips were faintly pale. She had noticed that yesterday and the day before. "Good morning, little one," she said, and he climbed onto the kitchen stool beside her as she set the triangles of toast in front of him. "Vivi, I dreamed about dragons again. They had wings like bats, but they were eating stars instead of flying." He said this as fact, the way children did, as if the dream world was simply another place that existed alongside the waking one. Dragons eating stars. That sounds dangerous. They weren't bad dragons, though. They were sharing the stars with the other dragons. Nobody was alone eating stars. She set the orange juice down in front of him and watched him lift the glass with both hands. His hands were small. Everything about him was small. She had measured his growth in millimeters, tracked his development against the doorframe in the hallway, and each new mark was something to celebrate because every inch meant he was still growing, still living, still here. "Oliver, what do we do when we feel tired?" She asked this every morning now. She had started asking 6 weeks ago when the episodes had begun. We stop and breathe. We don't push if our heart is too loud. He recited this like a prayer he had memorized. He took a small piece of toast and chewed it slowly. She had taught him that too. Slow chewing meant his heart did not have to work as hard during digestion. That is right. She touched the top of his head, felt the warmth of his scalp against her palm, and allowed herself exactly 2 seconds of terror before she forced her expression to stay calm. The episode came at 7:23 a.m., 14 minutes into his breakfast. One moment he was chewing his second triangle of toast, and the next his entire body went rigid. His hand flew to his chest. His mouth opened like he was trying to pull air from somewhere deep beneath the earth. Aria moved without thinking. She had practiced for this. She had researched this. She had prepared her entire life for this moment that she had hoped would never come. She pulled her watch from her pocket, always in her pocket, and looked at the second hand. 7:23 and 40 seconds. Breathe with me, Oliver. In through your nose. Hold it. Out through your mouth. His lips were turning a color that made her insides freeze. Not blue. Not quite. But the pale, waxy tone that meant his blood was not carrying enough oxygen. His fingers dug into the edge of the counter. 43 seconds, she whispered, not sure if she was saying it to him or to God or to whatever corner of the universe still harbored mercy. 56 seconds. 1 minute. You are doing so well, my love. So well. At 67 seconds, the episode broke. His body sagged against hers like a puppet whose strings had been cut. His breathing returned to normal in that gradual way it did, the pale color fading from his lips, color returning to his cheeks like someone was turning up the brightness on a dimming light. She carried him to the sunroom and lay him on the white sofa with the $100 per yard fabric that he was not supposed to touch. Let Victoria care about that. She pulled the medical report from the stack of papers on the side table and held it in her hands. Dr. Maurice's office. Pediatric cardiology. The words jumped out at her like they always did: valve deterioration, surgical intervention, 48-hour window optimal for intervention. She had memorized this report the way other people memorized scripture. The cost was printed at the bottom. $47,000. After insurance. Before hospital fees. Before anesthesia charges. Before the things that medical systems did not explain until after you had already signed the consent forms. She sang to Oliver while he recovered, the same lullaby she always sang, the same one her mother had sung to her when she was small and the world had not yet learned how to be cruel. By the time she finished the second verse, his breathing had deepened and his grip on her finger had loosened into the slack hold of sleep. At 8:15 a.m., Victoria Ashford was in the sunroom with 4 other women, all of them holding champagne glasses even though it was not yet 9 in the morning. They were celebrating the closing of a house in the Hamptons. A second house. A vacation home. Aria stood in the doorway with the medical report pressed against her leg, waiting for someone to notice her. They did not notice. She waited another 30 seconds and then cleared her throat. Victoria turned, and her expression changed from the bright, champagne-soaked smile she wore for her friends to something cooler. Aria. We are in the middle of something. I apologize, Mrs. Ashford. The medical report arrived from Dr. Maurice's office. About Oliver's valve. She held out the papers. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this conversation 1,000 times in her mind. It had never sounded as small as it did now. Victoria took the papers without actually looking at them, as if the physical act of holding them was sufficient. One of her friends, a woman with a face that had been pulled so tight it barely moved when she smiled, leaned in and whispered something that was definitely meant to be loud enough for Aria to hear. Honestly, Victoria, why do you keep that girl? She is always hovering around Oliver like some kind of surrogate mother. It is almost inappropriate. Victoria laughed. Actually laughed. The sound was like ice cubes in a crystal glass. Oh, she is harmless. And she works for practically nothing. I would be lost without her, truly. But she does get a bit attached sometimes. Oliver is not her child, after all. Aria felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. Crack. Like concrete stress fractured but still holding. She said nothing. She had learned 7 years ago that words were a privilege reserved for women whose rent was paid. The doctor says Oliver needs surgery within 2 weeks, she said anyway, because Oliver's breathing had turned the color of wax and she was not capable of staying silent about that. His valve is deteriorating faster than they expected. Victoria turned back to her friends, finally opening the envelope, and her expression shifted to something practiced and sympathetic. Oh, this is difficult, actually. Martin and I have the Hamptons house closing this month. The market timing was perfect, but it means our capital is tied up at the moment. The surgery bill, you understand. It is $47,000. I do understand, Aria. These things are always so expensive. But timing, you see? Not a good time. Perhaps in a few months when the Hampton sale has closed and Martin's bonus comes through. Aria's hands were shaking. She did not remember starting to shake. Mrs. Ashford, the doctor said the window closes in 2 weeks. After that, the valve will deteriorate beyond what surgery can repair. Victoria was looking at her now with something that was not quite kindness and not quite cruelty. Something in between. Indifference, maybe. Pure, crystalline indifference. Aria, I hear what you are saying. I truly do. But I am not responsible for paying for Oliver's medical care. Martin and I contribute to his insurance. We provide the best pediatrician in Miami. What happens beyond that is not within our control. One of the other women, Catherine something or other, reached over and squeezed Victoria's arm like she had just said something terribly brave. You are too generous with her, honestly. Most families would not employ someone in her situation. Aria turned and walked out of the room. She did not remember her feet moving. She did not remember the hallway or the stairs or the path back to the kitchen, but suddenly she was there, and her hands were gripping the edge of the marble counter, and the foreclosure notice was still in her pocket, crackling against her hip like something alive. $200 was all she had in her savings account. Not $2,000. Not $200,000. $200. Her entire net worth, represented by the balance in a bank account that she checked once a month with the grim attention of someone watching a wound that refused to heal. The phone rang at 2:37 p.m. Unknown number. She answered while folding napkins in the laundry room, still in this ridiculous uniform that had not been washed in 3 days because she was rationing laundry soap. Aria, sweetheart, it is Marcus. His voice was the color of oil. Slick and dark and impossible to clean off. We need to talk about your rent situation. Her stomach contracted. She had not heard from him in 3 days, and she had allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hoping he had forgotten about her. Mr. Webb, I sent you $200 last week. 200 of the 2,400 you owe me, yes. You are 3 months behind, beautiful. That is a problem for me. It creates a cash flow situation that I cannot sustain. She moved the phone away from her mouth and breathed. Just breathed. The laundry room smelled like lavender detergent and the ghost of other people's cleanliness. I can pay $50 next week, she said, each word a concession she was wringing from her own bones. And another $50 the week after. Here is what I am thinking, Aria. He had stopped calling her beautiful and moved to thinking, which somehow made it worse. You could come by tonight. 7 o'clock. My office. And we could work out an arrangement. You are a pretty girl. Pretty girls have options that less pretty girls do not have. I am a reasonable man. I understand financial hardship. I am willing to find a solution that works for both of us. The silence stretched. She counted her heartbeats inside it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, she said. Excuse me. No. I cannot do that. You cannot do that. He repeated it like she had said something incomprehensible. Let me explain something to you, Aria. You have 72 hours before eviction proceedings begin. I put the notice under your door myself. 72 hours. That is 3 days. In 3 days, you will be homeless. You and your little friendship with the Ashford boy will end. He will forget you within a month. That is how children work. But you? Where will you sleep? What will you eat? Who will remember you were ever here? The line went dead. She pulled the foreclosure notice from her pocket with trembling hands. Final notice. Bold letters. The words felt like a countdown. $47,000 for Oliver's heart. $2,400 to keep her apartment. 72 hours to make choices that no person should have to make. She sat down on the floor of the laundry room, surrounded by the clean linens of people who had never known this kind of mathematics. She allowed herself 90 seconds to cry. Exactly 90 seconds. She counted them the way she counted Oliver's breathing episodes, watching the time pass on her watch face. When the 90 seconds ended, she stood up, wiped her face with her sleeve, and fixed her hair. Oliver would be home from school in 37 minutes. He would need her to be okay. He would need her to smile like the world was not collapsing around them. She would give him that. She had always given him that. What she did not know, what could not have known, standing there in that laundry room surrounded by other people's luxury, was that in exactly 9 hours and 23 minutes, her entire life would change direction. A decision she had not yet made would pull her toward a mercy she could not imagine. But that was still the future. Right now, there was only the next moment. There was only Oliver. There was only breathing. The clock on the wall of the East Wing hallway read 9:53 p.m. when Aria first heard the service elevator open. She was on her knees, scrubbing the baseboards of white marble that had already been cleaned 100 times before, her $20 Target sneaker silent against the frosted floor. The winter night pressed against the windows outside, impossibly cold for Miami. The temperature had dropped to 43 degrees, and through the glass she could see frost creeping across the iron gates like a living thing. She had been working for 4 hours. Her hands were raw. Her left arm ached from the blood donation earlier that week, a routine screening at the clinic where she'd gone hoping to earn an extra $50. She couldn't afford that donation today, but the money had arrived in her account without explanation, along with a clinic note saying her blood type was rare and valued. She had pushed the question away. Bills didn't wait for answers. The footsteps from the elevator were heavy. Deliberate. She heard voices, rapid Korean, low and urgent, and every muscle in her body went rigid. She should move. She should hide. But Aria Wells had learned long ago that running only made predators run faster. Then came a sound that changed everything, a groan of pure pain, the wet gasp of someone whose body was failing them. She lifted her head slowly. 3 figures emerged from the shadows of the hallway. 2 men in tactical gear, shoulders broad as doorways, guns visible in leather holsters beneath their jackets. Between them, they were half carrying, half dragging a third man whose left side was soaked crimson with blood. The man's head hung forward, his black hair falling across a face that was ashen and drenched with sweat. He was tall, maybe 6'1", with sharp cheekbones and the kind of expensive watch on his wrist that cost more than everything Aria owned. His white dress shirt, custom-tailored, was destroyed. The blood spread from his ribs downward like spilled wine across marble. One of the men, older, with graying temples and a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, saw her. His hand moved instantly toward his shoulder holster. But the bleeding man collapsed before anyone could react. His weight was too much. He crumpled against a marble column 6 feet from where Aria knelt, his breathing shallow and irregular, the wet sound of a body beginning to shut down. The 2 men stood frozen, unsure how to move him without making it worse. The older one cursed in Italian. Aria should have run. Every survival instinct, every lesson learned in 27 years of barely surviving, screamed at her to run. But she recognized that sound, that desperate, drowning gasp. She had heard it 3 months ago when Oliver collapsed in the gymnasium at school. She had heard it in her own lungs once, when Marcus Webb had held her face underwater in the bathtub. She crawled forward on her hands and knees across the cold marble floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The older man's hand tightened on his gun, but he didn't draw it. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Aria reached the bleeding man and placed both palms against his wound. The blood was hot. His skin was cold. "Tell me what you need," she said. Her voice didn't shake. That surprised her. The older man, Marco, though she didn't know his name yet, stared at her for 3 seconds that felt like hours. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket and made a call. "The doctor. Now. He's losing too much blood." He paused. "No, we don't have that long. 30 minutes maximum." Aria pressed harder on the wound. The bleeding man's eyes fluttered open for a moment. They were dark, nearly black, and in them she saw something that looked like recognition, though that was impossible. He had never seen her before. He was slipping away too fast to see anything at all. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Stay with me. You're going to be okay." She didn't know if it was true. She had learned long ago not to make promises she couldn't keep. But she had also learned that the words themselves mattered sometimes. The sound of another voice. The fact that someone was choosing to stay rather than run. 10 minutes later, a woman arrived carrying a medical bag. She was professional, efficient, and she didn't waste time with questions. She started and fore in the bleeding man's arm, her fingers moving with precision that belonged in an operating room, not in a hallway in a private mansion. "We need blood," the woman said. She looked at Aria, then at Marco. "Type O negative, if possible." "I'm O negative," Aria said. The words came out before she could think about them. Marco's eyes narrowed. "You're sure?" "I just donated last week." "That's what they told me." The doctor set up a blood drawer on the spot, right there in the hallway, drawing from Aria's left arm while the older man took the blood and inserted it into the tubing that led to the stranger on the floor. His color began to improve almost immediately. His breathing deepened. His eyes closed, but this time with something approaching peace rather than oblivion. It took 45 minutes. When it was over, Aria felt dizzy and hollow. The doctor wrapped a bandage around the crook of her arm and said, "Rest. Drink water. Eat something with iron." Aria nodded. The woman packed her bag and disappeared down the hallway. She heard a service elevator open and close. Now it was just her, Marco, and the younger man, Theo, mid-20s, with nervous energy radiating off him like heat. They stood in the hallway. The bleeding man was gone, carried somewhere deeper into the mansion by 2 other men who had arrived silently. Marco pulled out his wallet. He counted out $500, the amount Victoria had promised her for the cleaning shift. Then he added another 1,000 on top, spreading the bills out in his weathered hands. "Take this," he said. His voice was low. "Go home. Forget you saw anything tonight." Aria took the money because refusing it would only raise more questions. She folded the bills carefully and put them in her pocket. 500 for saving a man's life. 1,500 for keeping her mouth shut about it. The math felt obscene. "Who was that?" she asked. Marco and Theo exchanged a look that contained entire conversations. Finally, Theo said, "Lady, you just gave blood to Dante Russo. You think we're worried about $500? The name meant nothing to her. That blank ignorance seemed to fascinate them both. A door opened at the far end of the hallway. The man, Dante Russo, walked out under his own power. His left shoulder was bandaged beneath a clean black shirt. His face was still pale, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but they were sharp. Alert. They found hers immediately. "Your name," he said. "Not a question." "Aria Wells." He stepped closer, studying her face the way someone studies a map of somewhere they might have been before. His accent was faint but present, rolling slightly over the RS. "Why didn't you run?" She tried to think of a good answer. A smart answer. Something that would make her seem brave instead of stupid. But all she had was the truth. "You were dying. I've seen that before. I couldn't just watch." Dante nodded slowly. Then he turned to Marco. "Find out everything about her. Where she lives. Where she works. Who she owes money to. Report to me by morning." Aria's stomach dropped. "I don't want trouble. I just need to go home." Dante's expression remained unreadable, but something in his eyes, something cold and sharp like a blade, showed briefly before he looked away. "You saved my life tonight. That creates obligations. On both sides. You'll understand that soon enough." He left. Marco gestured for her to follow him toward the service entrance. The night outside was crystalline and freezing. His car was a black Mercedes, pristine and silent. He drove her home through the empty streets of Miami, neither of them speaking. The radio played soft jazz. Her arm throbbed where the needle had gone in. By the time he pulled up in front of her apartment building in Little Havana, the one with the broken security lights and graffiti blooming across the brick, she had convinced herself that she would never see any of them again. She climbed the stairs to the third floor and collapsed on her mattress, still wearing her clothes. 3 days later, everything was falling apart. Oliver's condition had worsened. He'd collapsed during gymnasium class at school, unconscious for 2 minutes, his lips turning blue before the nurse revived him with an inhaler. He was home now, resting, but his breathing was a constant labor. Aria sat beside his bed, holding his small hand in hers, watching his chest rise and fall. "Aria, when will the surgery happen?" His voice was thin, exhausted. 6 years old and already so tired. "Soon, sweetheart. The doctors are going to help you soon. Mom said we can't afford it right now." His eyes, large and dark like his father's, met hers. "I heard her tell Dad. She said it costs so much money." Aria couldn't speak. Her throat had closed. "If I don't get it, I'm going to die, aren't I?" The silence was answer enough. That evening, Victoria Ashford called her into the study. The room was all mahogany and leather, smelling of money and cold air conditioning. Victoria sat behind her desk, her expression sharp as broken glass. "Aria, your employment is being terminated, effective 2 weeks from today. I've already contacted an agency about a replacement." Aria gripped the armrest of the chair. Her nails dug in. "Mrs. Ashford, Oliver needs." "I'm aware of what Oliver needs. That's not your concern anymore. You've become too attached. Unprofessional. Someone more appropriate will be hired." The words were precise. They were designed to hurt. Aria stood up, walked out, and didn't let herself cry until she was 3 blocks away. That night, at 11:15 p.m., her phone rang. "Marcus Webb. Your 72 hours ended at midnight yesterday." His voice was smooth, menacing. "I'm outside your building right now with the sheriff. You can either invite me upstairs to discuss payment arrangements, or I have eviction papers." "Please," Aria said. "I just need a few more days." "You said that last week." "I'm done being patient." He hung up. Aria sat on her mattress in the dark, looking at the foreclosure notice taped to her door, doing the mathematics of her own destruction. $47,000 for Oliver's surgery. She made $1,200 a month. The rent was due. The electric bill was due. There was no amount of scrubbing floors that could bridge this gap. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. Aria forced herself to stand, to open the door, to face him in the hallway. Marcus Webb was 52, overweight, with greasy hair and the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. He had a folder in his hand, an eviction notice, official and final. "There's my girl," he he said, reaching for her arm. But the hallway door opened. A man stepped through, Marco, followed by two other men in dark suits. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. Marcus's hand dropped from her arm. His face went grey. "Outside," Marco said. One word. They escorted him down the stairs. Through the lobby window, Aria watched them put him in a black SUV and drive away into the Miami night. She never saw Marcus Webb again. Theo stayed behind. He handed her an envelope. Inside, $5,000 in cash and a note written in precise, careful handwriting, for your housing. Consider it resolved. Aria stared at the money, her hands trembling, and she understood finally that her life had divided into two parts, before that night in the mansion, and everything that came after. 1 week had passed since Marcus Webb vanished into the Miami night, and Aria Wells had learned to live with the kind of fear that never announces itself. It simply settles into your bones like cold, making every shadow suspicious, every knock on the door a potential ending. She paid her rent to the new management company, a holding corporation nobody could trace, and tried not to think about where Marcus had gone or what happened to men who threatened people connected to Dante Russo. But Oliver was alive. That was the only mathematics that mattered now. 8 days after the blood donation, at 6:53 in the morning, Aria entered Oliver's bedroom to wake him for school. The November light was grey and thin through the window. She could see his small shape under the blue blanket, and something in the way he lay, too still, his chest not moving the way it should, stopped her breath. "Oliver?" She moved closer. His lips were blue. His skin had taken on a waxy quality, like a candle left too long in the sun. She screamed. The 911 operator's voice was calm and professional, but Aria couldn't hear the words. She knew only that the ambulance arrived in 4 minutes, that the paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, that they placed an oxygen mask over Oliver's face and his lips slowly shifted from blue to pink as they loaded him into the vehicle. She rode with him, her hand gripping his small fingers, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. At Miami Children's Hospital, the emergency room doctor was blunt in a way that suggested he had delivered this exact conversation 100 times. Dr. Patel was 42, with kind eyes and the exhausted shoulders of someone who spent his days delivering impossible news. "His valve is deteriorating faster than we anticipated," he said, and Aria felt the words like a physical blow. "Emergency surgery tomorrow morning. If we don't operate by 6 a.m., I can't guarantee he'll survive the week. The cost, $47,000. Upfront. Before they would schedule anything." Aria's hands were shaking as she dialed Victoria Ashford's number from the hospital corridor. The phone rang 4 times. When Victoria answered, her voice carried the satisfied languor of someone mid-massage. "Aria, I'm in the middle of a spa day. Can this possibly wait? Oliver stopped breathing this morning. The doctors say he needs emergency surgery tomorrow or he'll die. They need $47,000 today." Silence stretched between them like a blade. Then Victoria's voice, cold as winter, "That's not possible. Martin and I just closed on the Hamptons property. Our liquid assets are tied up. The surgery will have to wait until." "He'll be dead by then," Aria said, and she was screaming now, her voice cracking like glass. "Your son will be dead. Don't you dare take that tone with me." Victoria's voice had become something crystalline and cruel. "And frankly, Aria, your obsession with Oliver has become disturbing. I think it's best if you don't return to work. I'll have security box up your things from the closet. Consider yourself terminated effective immediately." The line went dead. Aria stood in the hospital corridor with the phone still pressed to her ear, watching parents and doctors flow past like water around a stone. The fluorescent lights were too bright. The antiseptic smell was suffocating. She was falling, and there was nothing beneath her. At 2:56 p.m., she walked out into the parking lot where the winter sun was bright but cold, the temperature only 51 degrees, the wind cutting through her thin sweater like a blade wrapped in ice. She found herself at the edge of a retention pond, dark water still as glass, frost on the grass around it. She sat on the concrete curb. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She opened her banking app, $247. That was everything. The $5,000 from Dante had gone to rent, to Oliver's medications, to bills that kept arriving with the inevitability of death. She had $247 and Oliver needed $47,000, and she had no job and no references, and Victoria Ashford had just ensured that nobody in Miami would ever hire her again. She thought about the pond. How cold it would be. How easy it would be to just stop moving forward, to let herself disappear into that dark water, to rest finally. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number, St. Mary's Hospital, room 302. Now. Another text, Oliver has been transferred. Surgery scheduled for 6 a.m. tomorrow. Already paid. Dr. Aria's breath came back. She ran. The Uber driver asked her 3 times if she was okay. She wasn't okay. She was barely alive, but she was moving, and movement was survival. She arrived at St. Mary's at 3:15 p.m., sprinting through the lobby, demanding information from the desk nurse who confirmed everything: private ambulance transfer, surgery scheduled, all costs covered by an anonymous donor. Oliver was asleep when she found his room, hooked up to monitors that beeped steadily like a heartbeat, his color better, his chest rising and falling the way it should. She sat beside him and cried silently, her hand on his small fingers. At 4:27 p.m., the door opened. Dante Russo walked in alone, wearing a black suit that cost more than everything Aria had owned in her entire life. She could see the stiffness in his shoulder, the careful way he moved. He didn't sit. Just stood at the foot of Oliver's bed, looking at the sleeping child. Aria stood. "Why are you doing this?" "You saved my life," Dante said quietly. "I'm returning the favor. Nobody does this. Not for strangers. What do you want from me?" Dante looked at her then, and his eyes held something that made her understand he was carrying a weight as heavy as her own. "Nothing. I want nothing from you. I don't believe you." A long silence stretched between them. Then Dante spoke, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. 15 years ago, I had a son. He had a heart defect. Hyperplastic left heart syndrome. The doctor said he could be saved if we got him to Boston Children's Hospital. I had the money. I had the jet. But I didn't have time. He paused. He died in my arms before we could take off. The air left Aria's lungs. She understood then what she was seeing, not a mafia boss, but a man who had lost everything. "I see that boy when I look at Oliver," Dante continued. "And I see someone fighting for him the way nobody fought for my son. So yes, I'm paying for the surgery. And you're going to let me?" Aria couldn't speak. Dante turned to leave. She found her voice. "I can't ever pay you back." At the door, without turning around, he said, "I don't want you to." He left. But what Aria didn't know yet, Victoria Ashford had discovered the connection. Someone had seen Dante at the hospital. Someone had told someone who told Victoria. And Victoria was not the kind of woman who lets anyone else own the narrative. That evening at 7:16 p.m., Victoria arrived with her husband Martin and her book club friends. They demanded to see Oliver. The nurses tried to stop them, but Victoria threatened legal action. She burst into the room, and when she saw Aria sitting by Oliver's bed, her face became something hard and predatory. "What are you doing here?" "I fired you." Oliver needed someone, Aria said simply. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "And somehow you managed to pay for all this?" "Let me guess, you've taken up with that gangster Dante Russo. Everyone's talking about it. The poor little nanny whoring herself out to a mafia boss." The words struck like fists. Aria's face burned. "It's not like that." "Of course it is," Victoria cut her off. "When he's done with you, you'll have nothing. And I'll make sure everyone in Miami knows exactly what you are." Oliver was awake now, tears running down his small face. Victoria swept out, her entourage following like shadows. But she wasn't done. Over the next 3 days, while Oliver recovered from successful surgery, Victoria launched a systematic campaign to destroy Aria's reputation. She called every wealthy family in Miami, every nanny agency, every childcare facility. She posted on private social media groups, painting Aria as unstable, obsessed, inappropriate. She claimed Aria had stolen from her home. She implied Aria was involved with organized crime. By the 4th day, Aria Wells was unemployable. That same night, in an abandoned warehouse in Hialeah at 11:02 p.m., Marco and 4 other men brought Marcus Webb forward, bound to a chair, conscious, terrified. He had been held for a week, fed and watered, but knowing death was coming. Marco approached. "You threatened to evict a woman for not sleeping with you. How many others, Marcus? How many over the years?" Marcus was crying, stammering about money, about payment, about anything that might buy him mercy. Marco nodded to the other men. They injected something into his arm. Marcus screamed. They didn't kill him. Too quick, too easy. Instead, Marco leaned close and whispered something into his ear that made Marcus understand that his fate would be far worse than death. They loaded him into a van. The vehicle drove away into the darkness, and Marcus Webb was never seen again. 2 hours later, Victoria Ashford stood outside the courthouse after the custody hearing, her hair disheveled, her perfect world collapsing. The IRS investigation into Martin's law firm had gone public. The bank had called in the Hamptons mortgage. Martin's law license was suspended. Oliver had been placed in Aria's temporary guardianship. Photographers flashed around her. Victoria screamed at the cameras, her voice raw and desperate, but nobody was listening anymore. She was already disappearing. After the rain, the sky clears. 1 year after Aria Wells first saved Dante Russo's life, the mansion on Star Island stood quiet in the winter darkness. Oliver slept upstairs, his breathing steady, the blue tinge finally gone from his lips forever. Downstairs, in what had once been a locked nursery, Aria and Dante sat by the window with 2 cups of tea cooling between them, the ocean stretched out below like a black mirror. Aria had not planned to ask about Marcus Webb. The question arrived unbidden, shaped by months of silence between them. What happened to him? After that night, Dante did not look away from the water. His fingers traced the rim of his cup, a small, deliberate movement. He was handed to people who understand predators. People for whom mercy is not in their vocabulary. He will never hurt anyone again. I should feel guilty, Aria said quietly. But you don't. No. I don't. The silence that followed was comfortable, earned through months of quiet proximity. They had spent 347 days rebuilding what the nursery represented, not erasing Jin's memory, but transforming grief into something that could hold life again. The white crib had gone to a family on the north side of Miami. The mobile with its moons and stars hung now in Oliver's room. The walls, once frozen in pale yellow, had become soft blue, the color of healing, of possibility. Dante set down his cup. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a decision fully made. I'm stepping back from the family business. Marco will take everything, the operations, the territory, the empire. I'm done. Aria turned to face him. In 15 years, Marco and Theo had never witnessed their boss step away from power. Now Marco was preparing to inherit an empire. Why? Dante's eyes moved to Oliver through the doorway, visible on the couch with an open book resting on his chest. Then back to Aria. Because I spent 15 years being the kind of man people fear. I'm tired of being feared. I want to be trusted. I want to be the kind of man who deserves. He stopped, started again. I want to be the kind of man who deserves you. Who deserves Oliver? Who deserves a second chance at a life I let slip away? Aria reached across the space between their chairs. Her hand found his. His fingers, scarred, strong, worn from violence and power, closed around hers with surprising gentleness. "You already have it." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of waves against the cliff below, that ancient rhythm that predates all human story. 3 weeks earlier, when Aria first opened the nursery door that Saturday afternoon, the space had felt like a tomb. The stuffed animals arranged on their shelves. The crib waiting for a baby who would never come. The mobile hanging perfectly still, patient as prayer. Dante had explained Jin while standing at the window, the name his Korean wife had chosen, the meaning of it, the way she had looked at him after the stillbirth, as if his power and his money and his connections meant nothing against the one thing he could not buy back. She had left him in the end. Soul. A different life. 14 years of silence broken only by lawyers. "I kept this room exactly the way she left it because I thought. I don't know what I thought. That if I changed anything, I'd be admitting he was really gone." Aria had stood in the doorway, her own grief for a child not hers sitting beside her. She thought of Oliver's first surgery, the way his small hand had reached for her in recovery, the only person he knew in a world suddenly full of pain. "What changed?" she had asked. Dante turned from the window. The afternoon light caught the scar that ran from his eye to his cheekbone, a map of old violence, old power, old choices. "I watched you fight for a child with no legal claim. You sacrificed everything, your job, your home, your reputation. I've been living in a tomb for 15 years while you've been living in the world, doing the work I was too broken to do." That was when Aria understood the months of protection. The apartment rent mysteriously reduced by half. The $5,000 anonymous donation for Oliver's school field trip. The car repairs covered under a warranty she never purchased. The job interview sabotaged by Victoria's lies, then quietly undercut by Dante's invisible hand buying her building, legitimizing her landlord, creating space for her to build something of her own. She had not been rescued. She had been given tools. She had been given time. She had been given protection while she saved herself. "I don't need you to organize the nursery," Dante had said. "I needed an excuse to see you again. To know if the help has been enough." Now, 1 year forward, it was enough. More than enough. Aria's business had grown to 15 employees and 50 regular clients. The local business magazine featured her last month, a full-page, color photograph, "Local woman builds $400,000 enterprise from nothing." Victoria Ashford had read that article in her studio apartment in Kendal, a place so modest it had no name, just an address. Martin's conviction for tax fraud and embezzlement had carried a sentence of 40 years federal prison. The Hamptons house was foreclosed. The social circle had evaporated like morning mist. Oliver had legal guardianship from Aria now. The adoption papers would be finalized next month. He was 7 years old, healthy, growing taller every week, and sometimes when he was happy or tired or caught off guard, he called Aria Mom. She never corrected him. "What will you do?" Aria asked now, watching Dante's profile against the darkness. "If you're not running the business." "I've been thinking about that." His voice was steady, almost peaceful. "There's a non-profit organization I've been funding anonymously for years. They help children with congenital heart conditions access surgery. They help single guardians navigate the system. Oliver qualified for them, though you didn't know it. The $47,000 surgery that terrified you for 3 days, it would have been covered. But you fought for it anyway." Aria felt something shift in her chest. "You let me suffer when you could have told me. I let you fight when you could have surrendered. There's a difference." Dante turned to face her fully. "I'm going to run that organization. Full-time. Legitimately. I'm tired of being the man who breaks things. I want to be the man who fixes things. The man who gives other people what you gave yourself, a chance to stand on your own ground." Outside, the wind picked up from the Atlantic, carrying salt and cold and the smell of rain coming. Aria thought of that first night in his mansion, when she had found him bleeding and had stanched his wound without fear, without hesitation, without knowing who he was. She thought of every moment since, the invisible protection, the quiet gestures, the way he had never once demanded gratitude because he understood that what he was building was not a debt between them but a foundation. "I love you," Aria said. It was the first time either of them had spoken the words aloud. Dante's grip on her hand tightened. "I know. I've known since the night you didn't run." "That's not how love works," Aria said softly. "You can't know something from a single moment." "Watch me." His voice was deep and solid like an oath. "I knew the moment I saw you standing over me, terrified but steady. I knew when you didn't ask questions. I knew when you fought for Oliver like he was made of your own bones. I knew every time you refused to take money from me, every time you insisted on building your own thing. I knew." The sound of footsteps on the stair came then, Oliver, half awake, coming down to find Aria. He was rubbing his eyes, his small body still heavy with sleep. When he saw Dante, he smiled without wariness. That smile was everything. That smile meant Dante had been transformed from the man people feared into the man this child trusted. That smile meant redemption was real. Oliver climbed into Aria's lap. Within minutes, he was asleep again, his weight solid and warm against her chest. Dante looked at them, the woman and the boy, intertwined, safe, and something in his face shifted. It was the face of a man who had spent 15 years in a locked room and had finally found the key. "What happens now?" Oliver mumbled, already half dreaming. Aria and Dante exchanged a glance. The real answer was this: they would wake together. They would build something neither of them had thought possible. They would transform a mansion full of ghosts into a home full of light. Oliver would grow up surrounded by two people who had fought their way to each other through violence and poverty and impossible choices. They would be a family, not by blood or law or accident, but by deliberate, chosen, daily love. But to the sleeping child, Aria whispered only, "We live, sweetheart. We just live." Sometimes one hand reached out at the right moment can change an entire life. Dante's hand had reached across months of distance. Aria's hand had reached first, stanching a wound, asking nothing, offering everything. Oliver's hand had reached up to both of them, trusting, innocent, believing in redemption before he understood what that word meant. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that compassion and courage can change everything. Drop a like if you believe in second chances. Subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's story of love, justice, and redemption. Thank you for staying until the end. Now go live your own second chance.